Economies have always and will always run on energy. For an economy to prosper, energy needs to be cheap. For an economy to be safe from geopolitical shocks, energy needs to be secure. And now, to meet new global commitments, energy eventually needs to be green in whatever form that may take. Now, in reality, most economies are struggling to achieve just one of these objectives. And trying to balance all three of these often opposing goals has in agrarian number of cases led to tangible long-term economic consequences. The global price of energy has almost tripled since 2000. Trade shocks continue to spook national energy supplies, and alarm bells are ringing louder than ever over our impact on the climate. The trouble is, they're conflicting interests. When push comes to shove, energy abundance and security come first. And nobody wants to make sacrifices while other economies benefit from going full steam ahead, since that won't fix the problem anyway. If you find this content valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like to support more insightful videos like this. But what if we simply stopped caring about the environment at all? If we looked at global warming purely as a cold-hearted economist, without care for the extinction of polar bears or habit-wrecking wildfires, unless, of course, it affects our GDP, then how would we arrange our energy systems and economies to maximize long-run economic prosperity? It's a pretty ruthless way to look at it, but it's pragmatic, because reframing global warming from an environmental issue to an economic one is probably the only realistic way to solve it. Now, of course, little disclaimer time, please don't take this too seriously. It's just that we may as well use our impending doom as a fun little case study, because otherwise, what's the point? So, can we make saving the planet economically viable? What are the problems we are currently facing with energy usage? And finally, are individual economies going to be willing to make this trade-off? We do a lot of writing here, for this channel and our sister channel, Context Matters. Between scripting episodes, editing drafts, and going back and forth with collaborators, clarity is everything. One confusing sentence can derail an entire argument, especially when the topic is complex economics or geopolitics. That's where Grammarly supports our team greatly. Unlike other AI tools, it works seamlessly where we write. Google Docs, Gmail, Slack, you name it, over 500,000 apps and websites. What makes Grammarly especially helpful is that it doesn't try to rewrite your voice. It enhances it by understanding your context. Whether we need to make something sound more confident, more neutral, or just more human, it helps us get the tone right and the ideas come across clearly. The free version already handles writing revisions with just a few clicks and has so many generative AI features. But with Grammarly Pro, you get strategic suggestions that make your writing more impactful, clearer, and more compelling. It even lets you translate text directly into 19 languages. Super useful when we're dealing with international sources or collaborators. If you want to improve your writing, whether it's for work, side projects, or just clearer communication, sign up and upgrade to Grammarly Pro to level up your productivity. You can use my link for 20% off Pro. Thanks again to Grammarly for sponsoring this video. Stay connected by subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up to help us keep providing high-quality financial and economic insights. Economic output and energy consumption have a self-perpetuating relationship, which is why the correlation between the two is so strong. The more energy a country has access to, the more it can power its factories, transport, electrical grids, basically anything that boosts growth and real incomes. The American shale boom was a great demonstration of this. In the early 2010s, it reduced energy prices by 47%, providing $74 billion a year of value to consumers and creating 725,000 new jobs. Iceland is another, and perhaps the clearest single example. Having harnessed its geothermal and hydroelectric energy, it's now one of the world's largest electricity producers per capita. It uses this energy to specialize in energy-intensive industries like aluminum smelting, cryptocurrency mining, and now AI data center operations. Abundant energy makes it not just one of the richest countries in the world, but also one of the most secure ones, since it's unaffected by geopolitical risks in the volatile global energy trade. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Germany had to quickly pivot away from Russian oil and gas. That was, and still is, painful for the highly dependent industrial giant. Energy prices rose by 35% to become some of the most expensive rates on the planet. High household costs lowered real incomes, and higher business costs reduced profits and investment. Inflation spread. Germany posted its first trade deficit since 1991, and business confidence has taken a hit ever since. The objectives of energy abundance and energy security are easier to align for some countries over others. If cheap imports are available, then great, but this leaves them inherently vulnerable to geopolitical risks. The dream is to produce cheap energy domestically, like Iceland has done, stimulating growth and protecting the economy from the dire situation Germany has found itself in. But to add to the complexity, countries are also getting pressured to decarbonize, something the majority of nations have pledged to do by 2050. So far, countries have struggled to reconcile the net zero objective with the objectives of energy abundance and security. Global consumption of fossil fuels continues to rise to levels never seen before, even for highly polluting fuels like coal. And while renewables continue to grow rapidly and become more price competitive, fossil fuels still make up the vast majority of global energy consumption. Perhaps unsurprisingly, 2024 was the hottest year on record. Not only that, but it was the first year to exceed the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And we only set this target 10 years ago. According to the United Nations Environmental Program, continuations of current policies and adherence to national deterrence contributions will lead to further temperature rises of 2.6 to 3.1 degrees Celsius by 2100. Now, some countries will be worse off than others. We will get to that later. But we all share the same atmosphere, meaning that this is a global problem. That's why people have rightfully pointed out the hypocrisy of a country like Australia, phasing out coal from its energy grid and boasting about its environmental achievements, just to ship it to China instead. It might make our emissions records technically cleaner, but the coal still gets burnt, and the same amount of carbon ends up in the atmosphere, irrespective of which country lit the match. In fact, if we have to burn marine diesel to get it around, it's probably worse. Norway is another example of this paradox. It continues to produce and export large volumes of fossil fuels whose emissions aren't counted in its national totals. Even China is full of contradictions. On one hand, it leads the world in renewable energy development with the largest solar and wind capacity of any nation. Yet at the same time, it burns over 50% of the world's coal, and it's approving new plants to meet soaring energy demand. We are clearly failing on the net zero objective, but does it really matter? I know wildfires, coral collapse, and mass extinction of species are pretty tragic from an environmental perspective. But what about as a cold-hearted economist? Is avoiding global warming in the best interest of the global economy? Just think of the GDP. Or in other words, how do the economic costs of avoiding global warming compare to the economic costs of global warming itself? Let's begin by understanding the problem economically. Negative externalities occur when the production or consumption of something creates a cost from a third party who's not involved in the transaction. In this case, fossil fuels produce negative externalities because burning them pollutes and contributes to global warming. And these costs are imposed on wider society, not the buyer or seller of the fossil fuels directly. The market price doesn't account for these social costs, which makes fossil fuels cheaper than they truly are. And this leads to overuse. It is a market failure, a classic case of the tragedy of the commons, where individuals acting in their own self-interest deplete or share a resource that is our atmosphere at the expense of the collective good. It's like a global smoking room. Each country thinks this one cigarette will help me work harder for the rest of the day. But as everyone smokes, the room fogs up with toxic fumes, and no one can breathe, and everyone suffers, even the non-smokers. But what are the actual economic costs of living in the world's worst hotbox? And well, there are a few. Firstly, global warming leads to more extreme weather events like storms and heat waves, and these damage assets, infrastructure, and productive capital. This is already happening. A recent estimate found that extreme weather events attributed to climate change cost $143 billion a year. In the US alone, the number of inflation-adjusted billion-dollar disaster events has been shooting up since the 2000s. And even if you're not directly impacted by extreme weather, higher insurance premiums for real estate spread the cost across the country. Increased frequency and intensity of flooding, heat waves, and droughts are reducing agricultural productivity. Harsher and less stable climates means more damaged crops and reduced yields, which is leading to higher prices for food, lower real incomes, and lower GDP. So far, human-induced global warming is estimated to have reduced global agricultural productivity by 21%. Then there's labor. Hotter temperatures reduce global labor supply and productivity in physically intense sectors, particularly construction and agriculture. A recent report from the London School of Economics estimates that up to 1.2 billion workers could have reduced capacity due to heat stress, and again, this reduces income and GDP. Higher temperatures will also lead to more heat stroke, exhaustion, and cardiovascular strain, adding pressure on healthcare systems and leading to more heat-related deaths. Then we have sea level rise, which is literally removing valuable land away from low-lying nations. But in the interest of comprehensive economic analysis, there are actually some economic benefits to global warming too. More carbon in the atmosphere can create a more fertile environment for photosynthesis. Carbon fertilization is expected to have a positive effect on certain crop yields, most notably wheat. Colder, high-latitude regions in Russia and Canada will actually become more agriculturally productive and habitable, helping to offset some of the agricultural losses from unstable weather patterns at the very least. Furthermore, cold-related deaths will reduce, and lower heating costs will create savings for consumers and businesses. And melting sea ice means new shipping routes in the Arctic, reducing travel time and fuel costs between Western Europe and East Asia. However, these benefits are regional, isolated, and exceptions to the rule. At the general level, an overall net effect of global warming remains decisively negative. The effects will also be unevenly felt. Essentially, countries that are already the hottest will suffer the worst of the effects. This means countries with tropical climates near the equator, who tend to be the poorest, most food insecure, and have contributed the least to global warming. This raises concerns about forced mass migration away from the equator, because if living conditions in these countries are already harsh, then imagine what they'll be like in 50 years from now. Now, on the bottom line, estimates vary. One of the most widely cited empirical studies estimates that global GDP would be about 23% lower by 2100 compared to a world without climate change. This is a median estimate, not the worst-case scenario. A newer study by the National Bureau of Economic Research suggests that the cost could be even higher at around 50% of global GDP by 2100. Crucially, these effects scale non-linearly. The hotter it gets, the faster economic output declines. Now, by either estimate, that's obviously a large chunk of GDP, but it's going to be costly to avoid the worst of global warming as well. So how do these costs compare? Well, lucky for us, there's research on this too. Limiting warming to safer levels below 2 degrees Celsius requires a deep transformation of the global economy, particularly the energy system. The Stern Review remains the most recognized and widely cited economic analysis of global warming to date. After a revision, it put the annual cost of climate mitigation at 2% of global GDP. This estimate is broadly consistent with the IPCC and IMF analyses. which generally find that 2 to 3% of GDP per year would be enough to fund the necessary investments to reduce emissions and adaptation measures. Stack side by side, the economic cost of global warming from a business-as-usual scenario is much larger than the cost of mitigating the problem. Unmitigated warming leads to a 23% loss in GDP annually by 2100, whilst mitigation and adaptation cost about 2 to 3% of global GDP annually. By and large, the consensus is that investment into mitigating the worst of global warming maximizes long-run global economic prosperity. So even if you don't care about the environment, we should care about global warming for our own sake. And an international survey of 700 top economists shows broad support of this conclusion. So then, why are we failing? Well, the mitigation costs are front-loaded. We pay them now, while the benefits only materialize after a lot of us are dead. And since as dumb humans we mostly care about the short term, investing the large sums required to mitigate climate change becomes suboptimal in terms of our own utility. Then there's the other main challenges. Global warming can't be solved by one country alone. It requires close-knit policy coordination at a global scale, but with increasing geopolitical tensions and a high arms race, low levels of trust between the two global superpowers, and a general erosion of the global rules-based order, it's becoming increasingly difficult to focus and cooperate on shared long-term issues. Richer countries have less incentive to take action because they aren't set to feel the worst effects of global warming. And on the other hand, poorer countries feel entitled to use fossil fuels for their own development because richer nations have done exactly that for centuries. So when you look at it from a global long-term perspective, mitigating global warming makes economic sense. But when you break it down, there's huge challenges in the way. And that's why net zero will only be achieved if it is economically viable. With that in mind, how can we realistically achieve net zero alongside the objectives of energy abundance and security? Well, renewable energies are obviously a great start. The International Energy Agency claims that 90% of electricity generation needs to come from renewables by 2050. And right now, it's around 40%. This means a massive scaling up of wind and solar farms, which is more feasible than ever, since these technologies continue to become cheaper and are now competitive with fossil fuels in terms of their levelized cost of energy. They also help to achieve energy security because they allow nations to produce energy independently on their home soil, which means these technologies may be the best solutions we have for achieving all three energy objectives simultaneously. But the concern with wind and solar is that they are intermittent. The sun doesn't always shine, and the wind doesn't always blow. The randomness and variability of their energy production is a hidden cost because it doesn't match the ebbs and flows of daily energy demand. If they're not producing enough energy, then we have to go back to a power plant or risk a blackout on the grid. They can also produce too much energy as well. Take Britain, for example. It's a windy island, but sometimes too windy. When wind energy exceeds energy demand, wind farms are paid not to operate. This cost is directly passed on the households. The intermittency issue can be reduced with more efficient grid systems, increased accuracy of forecasting, and shifting energy consumption patterns. But it's going to remain a prominent challenge because energy storage technologies remain a major bottleneck. That's why a more controllable source of basal power is essential, and nuclear energy is frequently touted as the solution. It provides a steady, reliable flow of clean, low-carbon power. France is the standout example. It has 56 nuclear reactors across 22 sites that provide 68% of its total electricity. This foundation maintains stable electricity prices. It also provides energy security because nuclear needs little imported fuel, is sourced from a diverse set of countries, and can be easily stockpiled for years. The benefits are clear to see when you compare it against anti-nuclear Germany, which is more exposed to volatile gas markets and pays 40% more for electricity. That's great, but nuclear has its own problems. It's just another one of those massive upfront costs. Take Hinkley Point C in Britain. As Europe's largest construction project, it's now years behind schedule and billions over budget. It has become bad PR for nuclear power. On the whole, the levelized cost of energy is higher than gas. New technologies like small modular reactors promise to improve cost efficiency through assembly line-style production, but this remains to be seen. For nuclear to truly compete economically, it would need groundbreaking innovation, hefty subsidies, or a sharp rise in gas prices. Nuclear also comes with political problems, even if they are overblown. While generating nuclear power doesn't automatically mean that a country can develop nuclear weapons, it inherently brings them one step closer. Past cases such as India's 1974 nuclear test show how civilian programs can be secretly directed towards military use. That said, major investments into nuclear power are necessary because a wave of old nuclear plants from the 70s and 80s are about to retire. So building new plants is a bare minimum just to sustain current levels of this low-carbon baseload energy source. That's why 31 countries have signed a pledge to triple nuclear energy capacity by 2050. Look, the long, hard, inconvenient truth is that there is no magic solution to achieving all three energy objectives simultaneously. As with most things in an economy, there's trade-offs which require value judgments. If we really want to hit net zero by 2050, then the incentives to decarbonize have to be stronger, and this requires government intervention. Carbon-based pricing seems to be the most popular way forward. It's basically a market-based tax on carbon emissions, and the cost represents the negative externalities of burning fossil fuels and incentivizes businesses and consumers to reduce their carbon footprint. The European Union's emission trading scheme is the world's largest and best-known carbon pricing scheme, setting the going rate for emitting CO2 at about 70 euros per ton. Companies that go over their emissions quota must purchase additional allowances, whilst those that pollute less can sell their unused credits, creating a market incentive to cut emissions. Today, there are around 80 carbon pricing systems worldwide, covering roughly 28% of global greenhouse gas emissions and generating around $102 billion in revenue last year. While their reach is expanding, most prices remain far below the estimated social cost of carbon, and generous free allowances blunt their impact, meaning businesses still lack a strong financial push to decarbonize. But these schemes are often thrown into the mix to explain why economies in places like Europe are stagnating, while places like the USA, which have been more heavily with their energy usage, continue to grow. With so many more immediately obvious economic challenges, it's a sacrifice many are unwilling or unable to make. This is despite overwhelming support from economists. In 2019, 3,649 of them, including the former Federal Reserve chairs and 28 Nobel Prize winners, signed the Economist Statement and carbon dividends. They endorsed a steadily rising carbon tax that would correct the well-known market failure and send a powerful price signal that harnessed the invisible hand to steer towards lower emissions. The proposal gained some traction, even corporate support, but it faced political opposition and never really went anywhere. Now we've made an entire video on the major economies of Europe, looking at a few more immediate reasons behind their stagnation. Environmental energy policy may be a great scapegoat, but it's far from their biggest problem, and you should be able to click to that video on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.